There is a flash of light so bright it erases everything. Not the kind of brightness you see when you step outside on a summer afternoon. Not the kind that makes you squint and reach for your sunglasses. This is something else entirely. This is the kind of light that reaches inside you, grabs hold of everything you are, and simply stops. One moment, there is a dying old man in a crumbling shack on the edge of the Caucasus Mountains. There is a ritual older than memory, blood running along the edge of an ancient blade, and words that make no sense to the man listening to them. And then there is nothing. When consciousness returns, it comes in pieces. A guttural hum, darkness, the smell of stale hay and dried blood, and then rope. Rough, unforgiving rope biting into the wrists of a body that is not his own. Alexei Prokhorov spent 52 years on this earth. He fought in Afghanistan. He bled in Chechnya. He buried friends in places so remote they don't appear on any map. He survived everything that two of the most brutal armed conflicts of the 20th century could throw at him, only to retire to a quiet village in the Vologda region with a bad leg, gray hair, and absolutely no one waiting for him. That is, until a letter arrived. A relative, supposedly, an old Cossack chieftain on the edge of death, somewhere in the northern Caucasus. A place called Volinsk. An address he had never heard of, belonging to a branch of his family he never knew existed. Most people would have thrown the letter away. Alexei bought a train ticket, and that single decision, that one small act of a lonely man reaching toward the only thread of human connection left in his life, would tear him out of everything he had ever known and drop him into a world 160 years in the past. What follows is not simply a story of survival, although survival is certainly part of it. It is not simply a story of warfare, although there will be blood enough to fill several lifetimes. It is a story about identity, about legacy, about what it truly means to belong to something larger than yourself. It is the story of a man who died in one century and was reborn in another. And it is only just beginning. Let us start where the story starts, not in the ambush, not in the ritual, but in the exhausted soul of a man who had outlived his own purpose. Alexei Prokhorov was what the Soviet military machine had spent decades perfecting. A soldier, not an officer decorated with medals and political connections, but the real thing, the kind of man who did the work that nobody else wanted to do, in the places nobody wanted to go, for reasons that were never fully explained to him. He had enlisted as a cadet, young and idealistic, in the way that young men always are before the world strips that idealism away layer by layer. He took his oath in a clean uniform with clean hands. He stood in a formation of other young men, all of them squinting into the future, none of them understanding what they were really promising. The barracks came first, then the brotherhood that forms in those cramped, exhausting spaces. A brotherhood forged not from sentiment, but from shared suffering, shared laughter, shared terror. The kind of bond that civilian life can never quite replicate, because it is built on the understanding that the man next to you might be the last thing you ever see. Then Afghanistan. There is a particular kind of weight that a person carries out of a war like Afghanistan. It is not the weight of the medals, though some of those were real enough. It is the weight of the names of the men who went in but did not come back out. Every soldier who survives a war like that carries those names. They become ballast in the chest, a permanent heaviness that never quite goes away, no matter how many years pass. Alexei carried his names. He carried them through his promotions, through his next posting, through the disorienting chaos of the Soviet Union's collapse. He had been a young captain then, watching the most powerful military empire in human history dissolve like sugar in warm water. The flags came down. The ideologies evaporated. The system that had given his life its shape and purpose simply ceased to exist, seemingly overnight. He would later describe it as watching a litter of puppies being carried to a river to be drowned. Everyone could see what was happening. No one had any power to stop it. All they could do was blink and fail to understand. Chechnya came next. A different kind of war, smaller in scale, if it is possible for any war to be called small, but no less savage. He led a special forces detachment, the kind of unit that did not officially exist and whose operations did not appear in any publicly accessible records. He was shot in the leg during the first campaign. The wound healed badly, left him with a limp that would follow him for the rest of his life, and ultimately ended his military career. He received a pension. He returned to Vologda. He found a village with a house that needed work and a view of the northern Dvina River that was genuinely beautiful on clear days, and he spent the better part of a decade being alone in a way that has no clean English translation. Not merely lonely, but somehow made of loneliness, hollowed out by it until solitude was less a condition and more a state of being. He was 52 years old. His hair had gone completely white. Every morning his leg reminded him of every choice he had ever made. He estimated that he felt approximately 70, which was a conservative figure. And then the letter. He did not know who had written it on the dying man's behalf. A neighbor, apparently, someone who had grown tired of the old chieftain's increasingly urgent requests. The letter was simple. A name, an address in a place called Volinsk. A vague reference to family, to blood, to the possibility that someone was waiting. That last part was the hook. That was what broke through the armored shell that 20 years of military service and 10 years of voluntary isolation had built around him. The possibility that somewhere in the world, someone was waiting for him. He bought a ticket on a sleeper train and traveled for several days through the grinding rhythm of Russian rail travel before reaching Pyatigorsk. From there, a taxi. From there, the long road into Cossack country. The old man was exactly as advertised. Ancient beyond easy calculation, so diminished by age that he seemed less a living person and more a collection of weathered bones held together by willpower alone. He lay in a tiny hut, a proper mazanka, the kind of clay brick dwelling you still find scattered across the Kuban and the Don, buildings that seemed to belong not to any specific century but to time itself. He could barely speak, but his eyes, those eyes were something else entirely. Alexei had served under men who had seen everything, who had been hardened by decades of command until the very air around them seemed to crystallize with authority. He had never seen eyes quite like this old man's. There was something in them that was older than age, something that saw more than it should have been able to see. The old man called him Grishka. Alexei had never been called Grishka in his life. His name was Alexei, and his papers confirmed this, and he had no particular reason to respond to anything else. He responded anyway. There was a chest. Old oak, bound with iron straps, the kind of thing you might find in a museum if you found it anywhere at all. A key on a cord around the old man's neck. Alexei opened it. Inside were things that told a story in objects rather than words. An old military belt, an ancient rifle, a hunting shotgun, cartridges in their original boxes, packed rucksacks, a ceremonial Circassian coat with silver cartridge loops, and wrapped in rough cloth at the top, a sword. A sabir, a shashka in the Cossack tradition. The old man, spending what was clearly some of his last reserves of strength, had him unwrap it. Simple scabbard, no decorative silver, no engraving, but when Alexei took the blade in his hands, something happened that he could not explain then and cannot explain now. He felt a kinship with the object. Not the trained familiarity of a soldier with a weapon, but something deeper, something ancestral. The old man drew blood. 3 points on his own wrist, then, with unexpected strength, a grip that seemed to belong to a different body entirely. He drew Alexei's wrist close and cut it too, and pressed the wounds together over the blade, and spoke words that seemed to come from somewhere other than his exhausted lungs. "You are the last. I am leaving. You are needed somewhere else. The bright thread is about to break. The falcon needs support. And then the light. The thing about waking up in the wrong body is that you know immediately. Not because of any single dramatic revelation. Not because you look in a mirror and see a stranger's face, or because someone calls you by the wrong name. You know because the body itself tells you. The weight is wrong. The height is wrong. The hands that you are looking at are not your hands. They are the hands of a child." Alexei Prokhorov, 52-year-old retired Special Forces captain with a bad leg and a chest full of dead men's names, opened his eyes in a barn somewhere in what appeared to be the mid-19th century. Hanging from a rope tied to a ceiling beam, occupying the body of a 13-year-old Cossack boy named Grigory Prokhorov. Both wrists were bound. The back was a ruin. Something had been done to it, something systematic and brutal, the kind of damage that spoke not of random violence but of deliberate punishment carried out by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The shoulders ached with the particular agony of joints held in an unnatural position for too long. The head was heavy and disoriented in the way that comes after a significant blow. A stooped man with a knotted head of hair and a filthy linen shirt had appeared, brought water in a clay pot, and let him drink. He had mumbled something contemptuous and limped away, and Alexei had hung there in the hot, stale air of the barn, listening to mice scratching in the walls, and tried to understand what had happened to him. The memories came slowly. They were not his memories, they were the boy's, Grigory's. They arrived like photographs developing in a darkroom, fuzzy at the edges, images from a life that was not his own layering over the hard-won experiences of half a century of a different existence. He could feel the confusion of two identities occupying the same mind, like two radio stations broadcasting on the same frequency. The boy's memories were strong enough to reconstruct a basic narrative. A journey from Volinsk to a market fair in Georgievsk. The return trip. A broken axle. A father who had refused help, insisting they could manage alone. Two men in a carriage who had pulled up without warning, identified the father as the primary threat, and fired a large-caliber pistol at him at close range. Matvey Prokhorov, father of Grigory Prokhorov, had died on the spot. Had not had time to understand what was happening. Grigory had rolled into the ditch and run. The bandits had taken the horse, the most valuable cargo, and left. The boy had spent what appeared to be most of a night burying his father with his bare hands beside the road, stacking stones, fashioning a cross from branches. Then he had walked, and somewhere on that walk, he had crossed paths with a nobleman in a carriage, and the nobleman had been displeased by some small transgression, and had ordered his men to take the boy. The nobleman's name was Zernovsky, a count. He summered in a fortified estate in the northern Caucasus. He had ordered 20 strokes of the lash applied to the boy's back, which the overseer named Prokhor had administered with what the fragmentary memories described as animalistic fury. 20 strokes. An adult man would be incapacitated by such a beating. For a 13-year-old boy, it was near to a death sentence. And yet here Alexei was, still conscious, still processing, still thinking. There was something in the merged consciousness that refused to simply stop. The soldier's discipline, perhaps. The soldier's body was gone, but the soldier's mind had come through intact. Let's take a moment to think about what this means. Alexei Prokhorov was not simply transported in time. He was not deposited in some neutral body and allowed to start fresh. He was placed, or he fell, or something pulled him, into a body that had already been pushed to the edge of death. A body that was small, malnourished, brutalized, and suspended from the rafters of a barn on a count's estate. Any reasonable assessment of the situation would arrive at the same conclusion. This was not a good situation. But then Alexei noticed something. Something small and strange and significant. On the inside of his right wrist, the boy's wrist, now his wrist, there were 3 dots. They had not been there before. Or rather, they had not been on the boy's skin as part of his natural markings. They appeared fresh, precise, arranged in a triangle, like a tattoo that had not required any needle or ink, like something had been written there from the inside. He had seen 3 dots like that before, just before the white light, on the dying old man's wrist, in a crumbling hut in a mountain village, in the year 2024. And as he stared at those 3 dots, something happened that had no business happening in any world governed by physics as he understood it. The old man's chest, the one from the hut, appeared in the air in front of him, not as a memory, not as a hallucination, as an object, fully 3-dimensional, solid-looking, real, hanging in the dusty air of the barn as though it had always been there, waiting to be noticed. And it was open, and at the top of it, wrapped in cloth, was a sword. The system had rules. Every extraordinary thing, it turned out, had rules. He discovered them the way you discover everything important, by breaking them first and paying the price afterward. The chest was real. He could reach into it and withdraw objects. He could deposit objects into it. The contents existed in what his 21st century brain wanted to call some kind of dimensional pocket, a compressed space where objects did not age, did not spoil, did not lose their temperature from when they were stored. Food placed inside would still be warm hours later. A wound dressing stored there would still be sterile. A loaded rifle would still be loaded. But using the system cost something. His body's energy, the small, fragile energy of a 13-year-old body that had been nearly beaten to death, drained with every use. Large objects cost more than small ones. Living things cost the most of all. He discovered this last rule in the most dramatic possible fashion, in a darkened forest in the dead of night, with a pack of hunting dogs closing in from 3 directions. But we will come to that. First, the escape from the estate. It was elegant in its simplicity, which is the best kind of plan when you are working with limited resources. He started by removing the ropes from his wrists. He had discovered, almost by accident, that he could transfer objects he was in contact with into the chest by concentrating on them, and that objects in the chest lost their connection to the physical world. The rope, when he focused on it, simply ceased to exist, dropping directly into the storage space and leaving only its absence. He fell, which was painful, but considerably less painful than continuing to hang. He found Ignati, the stooped man who had brought him water, coming into the barn that evening with a lamp. He had the man's clothes and the man's information within a few minutes of conversation conducted at blade point. Not his blade, the shashka had been deposited in the chest during his incarceration, but it was immediately available when he needed it, appearing in his hand from nothing in a way that would have been genuinely alarming to anyone watching. The interrogation was professional. He asked what year it was. He asked how many people were on the estate. He asked about exits and schedules and the current location of the overseer who had beaten him. 20-odd people. A black entrance to the main house that used a simple wooden bar as a lock. And Proker had already left the grounds. He neutralized Ignati with a precise blow that would leave the man unconscious but alive, bound him with the rope that the man himself had been using as a belt, and improvised a gag. The man would be found eventually. He might take some punishment for the escaped prisoner. Alexei was not comfortable with that, but the arithmetic of survival left him no choice. The main house yielded food. A cold pot of cabbage soup, a wedge of smoked pork, half a loaf of bread going stale. He was eating the soup standing at the kitchen table when the housekeeper, a formidable woman of considerable size who had apparently developed the unsettling ability to move silently despite those dimensions, appeared behind him and threw a ceramic pot at his head. He missed the full impact by moving at the right moment. The pot still connected with his shoulder. He dove through the open kitchen window, hit the ground in a practiced roll that sent white fire up through his abused back, and ran for the fence. Behind him, the estate was waking up. The housekeeper's voice had a carrying quality that could have been used for long-distance communication in any era. Lights appeared in windows, men's voices, and then, most alarmingly, dogs. He made it perhaps half a mile before the leg that had been a boy's leg for only a few hours began to fail in earnest. He ran on. He could hear the dog pack settling into a purposeful rhythm behind him, not the frantic early barking but the efficient, businesslike noise of animals that have found a scent and committed to following it to its conclusion. For dogs, he counted them by voice alone in the darkness, picking out the distinct tones of each animal as they converged on his position. He had one advantage. The boy's memories included some instruction from a grandfather in how to deal with attacking wolves, which transferred well enough to large dogs. Strike low, the legs, the tendons, then finish. It is important to understand what happened next in context. He was not a grown man at this moment. He was not in a body conditioned by decades of physical training. He was a 13-year-old who had been nearly beaten to death less than 12 hours earlier, running through unfamiliar forest in the dark with a borrowed coat and a very old sword that had somehow arrived in his hand from nowhere. 3 of the dogs he handled with the blade, using the boy's trained reflexes as a scaffold for the soldier's trained instincts. The 5th, actually, he had miscounted, took him down. And then something happened that was categorically impossible. He was on his back. The 5th dog was above him, its jaws closing on his right hand. He was out of options. He was, objectively, seconds away from a very bad outcome. He looked at the dog, and he wanted it not to be there. And he put it in the chest. Not by touching it with intent and focus, which was how he had understood the system to work. By pure, desperate wanting. And the dog was simply gone, yanked from existence with a sound like a breath pulled inward, leaving only an empty impression in the air and an extraordinary mess coming from inside his own skull. Nose bleeding, vision tunneling, nausea so severe he was certain he would lose consciousness before he could do anything useful with having survived. He checked the chest. The dog was inside. It was not breathing. The system apparently could move living things, but at a cost that was significantly higher than moving objects. And the cost of killing a living thing through transit, through the sudden, violent compression of moving a body into a space it was not designed to occupy, was simply that the living thing died. Instantly, without drama, without any apparent suffering, which was, he supposed, the only merciful note in an otherwise horrifying discovery. He lay in the forest for a long time after that. The estate dogs were still audible, somewhere behind him, following a false trail. The pre-dawn air was cold. His back was a collection of open wounds wrapped in borrowed cloth. His hand was bleeding from the dog's teeth. And somewhere above him, through the darkness and the pines, the stars of the mid-19th century Caucasus were burning with a clarity that electric light pollution would eventually steal from the sky forever. He thought about the old man in the hut. He thought about the 3 dots on his wrist. He thought about the boy whose body he was carrying, whose memories were slowly becoming more accessible, more integrated, less foreign. He thought about what the old man had said, in that croaking voice in those final moments. There is something wrong in our place. The bright thread is about to break. The falcon needs support. He had dismissed it as the delirium of a dying man. Perhaps he needed to revisit that assessment. The forest shelter lasted 7 days. Not because he wanted to stay, because the body he was in needed to repair itself, and even with the accelerated healing that he had already noticed, the wounds that should have been suppurating and feverish were instead quietly closing, the swelling reducing faster than any natural process had a right to explain. There was a baseline of rest and nutrition that simply had to be met before he could undertake a journey. The shelter itself was a rock formation, a natural overhang near a stream, concealed by ferns and root systems. He had found it by following the sound of water and the instinct of someone who had spent too many nights in too many terrible places to settle for anything exposed. He built a sleeping mat from dry moss. He set snares using cordage he fashioned from stripped bark. He caught a thin rabbit on the 3rd day. He caught a fish from the stream by the expedient method of damming the water with a fallen branch and waiting with a knife. It was not comfortable. It was not particularly dignified. But it was survivable, and survivability was the only metric that mattered at this point. The healing continued to astonish him. He had come from combat medicine. He understood infection, tissue damage, the timeline of wound recovery. He had seen men lose fingers to wounds smaller than what he was carrying. He had seen healthy adult soldiers die from infections that started as scratches. The wounds on his back, which should by any reasonable medical assessment have been his primary concern, were instead behaving like wounds he was watching in a time-lapse, closing, drying, knitting, reducing in size by the day in a way that made no physiological sense whatsoever. He attributed it to the 3 dots. He had taken to watching them in quiet moments, studying them the way a person studies something that should not exist but demonstrably does. They did not pulse in any visible way, but he had the distinct impression that they were not passive, that they were doing something, that whatever the dying old man had transferred to him through that extraordinary blood ritual was not simply a collection of mystical objects but something more fundamental, something cellular, something written into the physical matter of this borrowed body. On the 4th day, sitting cross-legged in the overhang while the afternoon rain came down in silver curtains beyond the ferns. He had his first real conversation with himself about the situation. He was Alexei Prokhorov, 52 years old, deceased, perhaps, or displaced, or translated by some mechanism that had no place in either scientific literature or his personal experience. He was now also Grigory Prokhorov, 13 years old, Cossack of the station of Volinsk, Northern Caucasus, in the year 1860. These two identities were sharing the same body and gradually the same mind. Grigory's memories were becoming more available to him, not replacing his own, but supplementing them, providing context and vocabulary and the baseline familiarity with this world that was the difference between surviving it and simply being consumed by it. He was carrying, in what he could only describe as a supernatural storage system, the following assets. One ancestral saber in exceptional condition, one old military rifle borrowed from a sleeping guard, one hunting knife, various items of clothing, a cast-iron cooking pot full of cold cabbage soup, a substantial portion of smoked pork, a loaf of bread, an old woolen blanket, a length of rope, a small amount of ammunition for the rifle, and the dead body of a large dog that he was eventually going to have to do something about. He was owed, in some cosmic sense of the phrase, by a count named Zernovsky who had ordered 20 strokes of the lash applied to a boy who had done nothing to deserve them. He was traveling to the station of Volinsk, which was approximately 80 to 100 kilometers distant, to find a grandfather he had never met, to inhabit a life he had not been born into, and to figure out what exactly was meant by a bright thread that was about to break. He was 13 years old in a body. He felt 52 in a mind. He was going to have to navigate a society with its own rigid codes, its own social hierarchies, its own systems of law and honor, while also dealing with the physical limitations of adolescence and the psychological weight of a double identity. He should have been terrified. He was, if he was honest, mostly curious. The soldier's mind, it turned out, was very good at adapting to impossible situations. It had been trained for exactly this, not for time displacement, obviously, but for the fundamental experience of being dropped into an unfamiliar environment with inadequate resources and told to make it work. The specific parameters were unprecedented. The underlying skill set was not. He finished the rabbit, packed his improvised camp, and started walking. The road from the forest to Pyatagorsk was more eventful than he would have preferred. Not immediately the first day out of the woods was quiet, a slow walk along the edge of agricultural land, following the general direction of the sun and cross-referencing with the patchwork of Grigory's memories, which were helpful in the way that a map drawn by someone who had made the journey once, as a child, on the back of a cart is helpful, directionally useful, short on operational detail. He acquired boots, clothing, and intelligence from 2 Chechen raiders who attempted to rob him. This requires some context. The Northern Caucasus in 1860 was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a stable region. The Great Caucasian War, which had consumed Russian military resources for the better part of 40 years, was in its final stages. Imam Shamil, the legendary Avar leader who had united the mountain peoples in resistance against Russian expansion, had been captured the previous year and was reportedly living in exile in Kaluga. But the capture of a leader does not instantly end a war, and the mountain regions were still threaded with bands of what the Russian and Cossack populations called abreks, hardened fighters, some of them ideologically committed to continued resistance, many of them simply opportunistic bandits operating in the confused aftermath of a generational conflict. 2 of these individuals found him on a forest path, thinking they had found easy prey. A lone, slightly undersized boy in ill-fitting clothes, walking with no obvious escort and no visible means of defense. They were wrong about the visible means of defense part. The rifle appeared in his hands from the chest, already charged. He had used the intervening days to master the sequence of powder, ball, ramrod, and percussion cap, and the first abrek took the shot square in the chest at approximately 20 meters. The second froze for exactly the critical interval, seeing his companion go down and his own rifle still in the process of being aimed, and that interval was enough for Alexei to close the distance and demonstrate that while the body he was in was not particularly large, the mind controlling it had been in this exact situation many times before and knew every possible continuation. He did not kill the second man. He thought about it, the professional calculus ran automatically, as it always did, assessing threat and opportunity and the specific economics of witness elimination. The man was young. He was terrified. He had, in all probability, made a series of bad decisions that had led him here, to this moment of having a knife at his throat held by a boy who did not fight like a boy. Alexei tied him up, took both horses, all the food, both rifles, 2 good knives, and a small amount of silver coins. He transferred the second abrek from the physical world into the chest, which killed him just as efficiently and quietly as it had killed the dog. He had the body in the chest for approximately 40 minutes before he found a suitable ravine, out of the way of any path or road, and deposited it there. He felt worse about this than he expected to. He spent some time, sitting on one of the confiscated horses on a quiet hill, thinking about the fact that he had killed 2 human beings. 2 men, however hostile, however dangerous, in less time than it took to drink a cup of tea. He thought about the system he carried, about the extraordinary ease with which it allowed violence to be delivered and consequences to be erased. He thought about what it would be very easy to become, with capabilities like this and the background he was carrying. The 3 dots on his wrist caught the afternoon light. They were always there, always present. He had begun to feel them as a kind of moral weight as well as a physical marking. The grandfather, Grigory's grandfather, Ignat Arafyevich Prokhorov, was described in the boy's memories as a formidable man. A man with standards. A man who had spent his life in the kind of service that requires you to be genuinely good at violence but equally insistent that violence has a proper place and should not exceed it. A man who would have very specific opinions about what his grandson was becoming. He decided to try to keep the body count below what was strictly necessary. It would not always be possible. He was going to discover this repeatedly in the months ahead. But the decision itself mattered, and he made it consciously on that quiet hill, with borrowed horses and dead men's weapons and a long road still ahead. The journey to Pyatigorsk took 2 days on horseback. He arrived in the Cossack settlement of Goryachevitsk, which sat at the foot of Mount Mashuk and served as the civilian neighbor to the resort town of Pyatigorsk, in the early afternoon of the 2nd day. The air smelled of coal smoke and fresh bread and horse dung. There were women at the well, men in Cossack uniforms repairing harnesses in a courtyard, children chasing a dog down an unpaved street. Dogs seemed to be everywhere. He found the station administration building by memory, Grigory's memory of having passed it once before, and presented himself to the district ataman, a man named Kluev, with the following story. He was Grigory Prokhorov, son of Matvey, from Volinsk. His father had been killed by bandits on the return from the Georgievsk fair. He had walked most of the way home. He had encountered and dispatched 2 Chechen raiders on the road. He was now presenting the ataman with the raiders' horses as evidence and asking for documentation confirming his identity and purpose. The ataman, a weathered man with the eyes of someone who had seen enough to stop being surprised by most things, listened to all of this with the particular stillness of someone who was making a dozen silent assessments simultaneously. He looked at the horses. He looked at the boy. He looked at the horses again. He issued the documentation. He offered to have the boy stationed in town, cleaning stables and running errands, until he could be safely returned to Volinsk. Alexei declined politely and asked instead for the news from Volinsk. What came back was a gut punch delivered in the measured cadences of official reporting. There had been a raid. A large raid, while most of the male Cossack fighters were away on a mutual aid deployment to help a neighboring station. Approximately 200 fighters. The station had defended itself with what was available: old men, boys, women with pitchforks. They had held. But the losses were significant. Women taken captive, civilians killed, and the grandfather, Ignat Arafyevich, had been wounded. He was alive, but the wound was severe. And the house, Grigory's house, the house that Grigory and Matvey had left 4 weeks ago for a simple trading journey, was gone. Burned. Nothing left but the clay walls and the chimney. He thanked the ataman, bought what supplies he could afford with his small collection of stolen silver coins, and headed for Volinsk as fast as the roads would allow. Along the way, in the early evening of the first day's travel from Pyatigorsk, he encountered two figures on the road. A young woman of perhaps 20, walking slowly, stumbling with exhaustion, carrying a small girl of perhaps 3 on one hip and a bundle of belongings in her other hand. Her clothes were peasant clothes, covered in road dust and dry blood that was not her own. Her eyes were the gray-green of deep water, and when he approached, they looked at him without fear but with the directness of someone who has already been through the worst thing they can imagine and has stopped spending energy on secondary concerns. Her name was Yelena. Her husband had been killed in a night raid on a party of settlers relocating from Voronezh province. She had escaped with her daughter by rolling into a ditch. She had been walking for 3 days. He helped her onto the horse. He walked beside them the remaining distance to Volinsk. He did not know, at that moment, that she would become the 3rd permanent member of his household, that her daughter Mashenka would attach herself to the household with the focused intensity that small children reserve for places where they finally feel safe, that Yelena herself would prove to have the steady competence and the quiet courage that makes the difference between a house that merely exists and a home that actually functions. He found out later. For now he walked. The station of Volinsk, when they arrived, looked like a place that had been through a war. Because it had. Every 3rd house was a ruin, charred roof beams sticking up from blackened walls like broken ribs, the clay surviving where wood had not, the chimneys standing alone in fields of ash like monuments. The streets were quiet in the way that places become quiet after violence. A specific silence that is different from ordinary evening quiet because the people who are making it are still waiting for the next bad thing. The grandfather was in the barn. He lay on a simple wooden platform, wrapped in a salvaged blanket, a bandage around his head darkened with old blood. His face in repose was exactly what Grigory's memories had promised, carved by decades into something that looked more like a relief map of a hard country than an ordinary human face. Thick gray mustache, closed eyes, hands on the blanket that were the hands of a man who had worked with them every day of a long life. The eyes opened, found him. The grandfather said, "Alive. I thought it had all burned, Grushenka. Everything had burned." He brought water to those cracked lips. He rewrapped the head wound with clean cloth from the chest. He covered the old man again. And for the first time since the white light, he felt something other than urgency, calculation, or pain. He felt, in the body of a 13-year-old boy and the soul of a 52-year-old soldier, the specific sensation of coming home to a home he had never actually seen before. Now, here is where the story accelerates. Because if the first act of this journey was survival, getting out of the barn, crossing the forest, making it to Volinsk with a borrowed body and a dead man's sword, then the second act was construction, building something. And this is where the extraordinary thing about this particular displaced soul begins to reveal itself. Because Alexei Prokhorov was not simply a soldier. He had spent 10 years after the military in a village, which meant he had spent 10 years doing the things that village men do, repairing roofs, cutting wood, maintaining structures, growing things, maintaining the physical infrastructure of a small independent life. He understood how things were built and why they were built that way and what could be improved and what was the product of tradition that had survived because it worked. He was walking through the ruins of a 19th-century Cossack homestead with the accumulated knowledge of late 20th-century domestic engineering rattling around in his head, and he kept seeing improvements everywhere he looked. The burned house had solid clay walls, could be rebuilt, but the roof, he was not going to replace the traditional thatch. Thatch was why half the station had burned. One ember from a raid, and the entire settlement became a chain of pyres. He wanted ceramic tile. Not because it was prestigious, but because it was fire-resistant, and fire resistance was the single most important property a roof could have in a region where raids were a regular occurrence. The floor, the traditional packed earth floor, would go. He wanted wood. Laid tight, caulked clean, something he could actually sweep rather than periodically relayer with clay. The water, there was a stream running 20 meters from the property boundary, with a natural fall point just upstream that was higher than the house itself. A simple timber trough, properly angled, could run water directly into the yard. Not a faucet, not quite, but a continuous low-pressure supply that would eliminate the daily exercise of hauling buckets from the well 300 meters down the road. A bathhouse, A proper one, the kind he had grown up with in Vologda, with a separate antechamber and a deep bench for steam and a cold plunge pool fed directly from the new water system. A privy, he designed a mobile one, raised on a skid, so that the pit could be repositioned annually, enriching the kitchen garden soil systematically rather than contaminating a fixed spot indefinitely. The neighbors and workmen who helped with the reconstruction received all of this with a mixture of amusement, bewilderment, and grudging respect. The plumber's boy, which is essentially what they called a child who had opinions about water, was an unusual species in 1860 Volinsk. But the water flowed eventually. The ceramic tiles went on the roof in late August of 1860, and the first time rain fell on them with that clean, hard percussion that is so different from the soft absorption of thatch. The grandfather sat in his rocking chair on the new veranda. Where did the rocking chair come from? Nobody quite knew. The boy had apparently found it somewhere, and smoked his pipe in audible satisfaction. There was a debt, a significant one. The trading journey to Georgievsk had been conducted on behalf of the station community, and the goods and money lost to Matvey's death were owed to a dozen different families. The Ataman had already covered the immediate crisis from the station's reserve funds, but the underlying obligation remained. He began to address it methodically. The Chechen horses he sold, the weapons from the forest encounter, repackaged as hunting trophies rather than battle spoils, generated additional cash. A captured pair of horses during a second encounter with raiders near the forest trails north of town. Yes, another encounter, we will get to this. Added more. This second encounter needs some explaining. He was out hunting, genuinely hunting, trying to supplement the station's meat supply with something from the hills. He had taken a shot at a young deer and was processing the animal when two armed men in the undergrowth opened fire on him. They were not Chechen fighters. They were, based on their equipment and technique, professional hunters of a human rather than animal variety. One had a rifle of unusual quality, German, he suspected, a needle gun, a Draze, which in 1860 was about as cutting-edge as firearms technology got in this part of the world. He managed both of them. One he shot. One he neutralized with a pistol he drew from the chest, the Lefachew's revolver taken from Zernovsky's abandoned camp weeks earlier, which had become his primary sidearm. He was faster than they expected because they had expected a 13-year-old boy. There was a pattern developing, and he was not yet sure what to do with it. The pattern was, Zernovsky had not forgotten him. Let us pause here and talk about Count Zernovsky, because he is not simply the villain of a localized story. He is a window into something darker and larger. Mikhail Zernovsky was a St. Petersburg nobleman who owned a summer estate in the Georgievsk region, which was something of an oddity. The Northern Caucasus was not typical summer resort territory for the Russian aristocracy, most of whom preferred the milder social landscape of Crimea or the cultural resources of Europe. His presence there suggested something more purposeful than leisure. A retired captain of the secret police who had been watching Zernovsky for several months would eventually tell Grigory technically, though the distinction was becoming increasingly academic, that the Count had been making regular contact with a customs inspector in Pyatigorsk, and through him with networks that extended out of Russia entirely. French networks, specifically. In 1860, France was still processing the aftermath of the Crimean War, in which a French-British Ottoman coalition had fought Russia to an expensive standstill and imposed treaty terms that included significant restrictions on Russian naval power in the Black Sea. The political will to further weaken Russia, to keep the empire distracted and undermined, remained strong in Paris. One of the ways you undermine an empire is by keeping its periphery on fire. The Northern Caucasus was the empire's most expensive, most difficult periphery. 40 years of war. Hundreds of thousands of casualties. Infrastructure that remained primitive. Populations that had never fully reconciled themselves to incorporation. Even with Shamil captured and the formal war essentially over, the region was a persistent drain on Russian military and administrative resources. Several somebodies working through intermediaries like Zernovsky, was funding the continued activity of the remaining mountain bands. Not because they believed in Caucasian independence as a principle. Because a burning Caucasus was an expensive Caucasus, and an expensive Caucasus was a useful tool in the ongoing project of keeping Russia too busy and too poor to project power elsewhere. Zernovsky was the conduit. The local shopkeeper Kostrov had been the distribution mechanism, passing money through his legitimate business as a front for payments that eventually reached fighters in the hills. A provincial police inspector named Leshchinsky, with falsified credentials, had been tasked with managing the local end of the network and ensuring that complications did not arise. And the single largest complication currently facing the network was a 13-year-old boy in a Cossack station who had somehow survived being beaten to death, neutralized a pack of hunting dogs, escaped the estate, and subsequently appeared to be connected to whatever investigation was being conducted from Stavropol. This is the context for everything that followed. This is why Zernovsky needed him dead. And this is why, on the night that the water channel from the stream was finally completed and clean water ran for the first time into the yard of the rebuilt Prokhorov homestead, on the night that should have been nothing but quiet satisfaction and the sound of water flowing where no water had flowed before, a figure appeared in the darkness outside the gate. The water ran. He had been waiting for this moment longer than he could easily measure. The channel was an elegant piece of improvised engineering. Timber troughs cut from larch wood, seated on clay supports fired in a small field kiln that had taken 3 days to build, angled at a precise gradient that Myron the carpenter had repeatedly referred to as lunacy until it actually worked. Water from the natural cascade upstream now flowed into a small collecting pool in the yard, gravity-fed, constant, clean. The moment it actually worked, when the thin silver line emerged from the end of the trough and struck the stone of the pool with a sound like a tiny bell, the reaction was disproportionate to the scale. The grandfather came out of his chair. Yelena made a sound that was part laugh and part something more complex. Mashenka, who had been sitting on a fence post eating a stolen apple, dropped the apple and ran to put her hands in the stream of water. The workmen stood around looking at it with the specific satisfaction of people who have been told something was impossible and have now watched it happen. Myron, who had done more than anyone to make the roof, the floors, the water system, and now the small veranda happen, shook his head and said something that translated approximately as, "You are the most peculiar 13-year-old I have ever encountered, and I have been building things for 30 years. That night, after the workmen had gone home and Mashenka was asleep and the grandfather was on the veranda with his pipe and Yelena was washing dishes in water that had arrived without anyone carrying it, Alexei sat in the gathering dark and noticed the tracks by the gate. Wide heel, nails driven in an unusual pattern. He had seen that pattern before, several times, always associated with subsequent violence. He said nothing to the household. He collected Mashenka's small body from the sleeping mat where she had fallen asleep and moved her to a more protected position. He told Yelena to sleep with the interior door bolted. He explained to the grandfather, in brief and oblique terms, that there might be a visitor during the night. The grandfather looked at him for a long moment. He did not ask questions. He nodded. He was an old man, but he was not a foolish one. Kostrov the shopkeeper arrived at the gate just after midnight, stumbling, bleeding from a split lip, holding something in his extended hand with the deliberateness of a man using his last strength for a single purposeful act. He said, "Here, take it. Leshchinsky knows everything." And then he collapsed. Leshchinsky himself came through the gate 4 seconds later, revolving pistol already in his right hand, left arm in a sling. A familiar sling on a familiar arm, the one that had been wearing a sling since the mysterious forest encounter some weeks past. So, not a mountain fighter. A provincial police inspector who had falsified his credentials and was now here, personally, to clean up a loose thread. The conversation that followed was brief and had the quality of two people who both understood perfectly well how it was going to end, merely disagreeing on the specific mechanics. Leshchinsky offered a deal. He declined. Yelena appeared from inside. He had specifically told her to stay in, and the distraction created exactly the kind of 2-second window that allows options that didn't exist a moment ago. What followed next brought the neighbors out of their houses, brought the Ataman running, and ended with Leshchinsky taking his pistol into the darkness and the body of Kostrov in the yard and Alexei standing there in the gate with 3 dots burning on his wrist. In the investigation that followed over the next several days, the seriousness of what had been uncovered became increasingly apparent. The station-level problem, shopkeeper, inspector, missing money, opened upward into something that involved the Provincial Secret Service office in Stavropol, the offices of the region's appointed ataman, and eventually the staffs of the military headquarters for the Caucasian Line Cossack Army. A letter arrived from Stavropol, from a staff captain named Andrei Pavlovich Afanasiev. He was invited, in the particular way that such invitations are issued, to come to Stavropol. There were things to discuss. Yakov, the best of the Piastan scouts in the station, was assigned to accompany him. Stepan and Trofim, two dependable young Cossacks, rounded out the escort. Before they left, in the quiet of the evening before departure, the grandfather said something that needs to be understood in its full weight. He brought out the second saber. There is a tradition in the Prokhorov family, or there was in the telling of the grandfather who was the last keeper of these stories, of what the old men called marked warriors. Not all warriors, not even most warriors, but in every generation, or sometimes skipping 2 or 3, a warrior who carried something extra. Wounds that healed too fast. A sense for danger that operated before conscious thought. An affinity with certain creatures, particularly birds of prey. A connection to objects that went beyond ordinary ownership. The last such warrior, in the telling, had been an Esau named Alexei Prokhorov, who had been born in 1674 and died at the Battle of Poltava in 1709, fighting beside Peter the Great against the Swedish army of Charles XII. He had been extraordinary by all accounts, not simply brave or skilled, which most Cossack officers of his era were by definition, but something more. A pattern reader. A survivor of things that should not have been survived. He had carried a saber. The grandfather brought it out now and laid it beside the second saber, the one that had arrived with the boy in the barn, the one that had somehow traveled with him from the future, and they were identical. The same curve, the same crossguard, the same balance, the same tiny falcon stamp on the blade near the guard. This was not possible. It was also undeniably the case. The grandfather said, "The sword of Alexei Prokhorov has come to you, and the spirit he is using to work it is not the spirit of a 13-year-old boy." Alexei said, "Dita, I don't know what to tell you." The grandfather said, "You do not have to tell me anything yet. Perhaps one day. Both sabers are yours now." He handed over the wooden whistle next, carved in the shape of a falcon, worn smooth with decades of handling. He explained the story attached to it, the legend of the Kipchak Khan who had surrendered a living falcon in exchange for his own freedom, the supposed compact between that ancient nomad lord and the Prokhorov bloodline that had kept the terms of the contract across generations. He put the whistle on the cord around the boy's neck. 2 days later, sitting by a stream in the forest during a hunting break, he blew the whistle, and a young Saker falcon dropped out of the sky, hit him in the face, drew blood from his cheek with 2-inch talons, and then calmly sat on his arm and looked at him. The falcon's name was Khan. This was not the original falcon. Not the Khan's falcon, obviously. 800 years was too long even for the Prokhorov family's remarkable biological legacy. It was a young bird, barely fledged, less than 2 months out of a nest somewhere in the hills. But when the blood from the whistle's scratch touched the carved wood, and the whistle sounded, and the falcon arrived, something happened that changed the nature of what he was. He discovered it incrementally. First, a sense of the bird's presence, even when it was not in sight. Then, a sense of the bird's direction and rough altitude. Then, on the 4th attempt, lying flat on his back in the dry grass and concentrating with the kind of deliberate focus that fighting men develop for stillness. Full visual access. Through Khan's eyes. Not imagination. Not a vivid visualization. Actual visual input, from the elevated perspective of a bird in flight at roughly 40 meters altitude, with the physical sensation of updraft under wing and the slight dizzying motion of a body that navigates air rather than earth. He could see, from that position, approximately 5 kilometers in favorable conditions. He could see his own body below, lying in the grass in a way that must have looked deeply alarming to anyone who happened to pass. He could see the station of Volinsk in one direction and the approaching hills in another and, on the day that he stayed with the connection long enough to map the whole area, the track of a small Chechen patrol moving through the low brush toward the station perimeter. He reported this to the ataman. The patrol was intercepted. For men alive, which created the opportunity for the kind of intelligence exchange that proved, in the weeks that followed, to have significant value. The capabilities he was developing were a dimensional storage and retrieval system for objects and, at great cost, living things, accelerated healing, whatever had woken in him through the falcon whistle, which appeared to be some kind of shared sensory field with a specific bird of prey. He was developing, in other words, a very particular skill set. He had not yet fully understood what it was for. Stavropol is approximately 200 kilometers from Volinsk by road, a journey that in 1860, on horseback with no hard surface routes and several river crossings, took the better part of a week. He was arrested on the second evening. The arrest happened, like most things in this story, because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time with too much situational confidence. He had stepped outside the inn where the party was staying to get fresh air. A carriage came through too fast on a narrow street. He had grabbed the lead horse's bridle to prevent being knocked into the wall. The horse had shied. The carriage had stopped with unexpected speed. The young man inside the carriage had exited in a fury, introduced himself as Alexei Petrovich Brekhaninov, son of the governor of Stavropol province, and demanded satisfaction. The attempted satisfaction had involved a cane, which Alexei declined to simply accept, and the young nobleman had found himself sitting in the mud of the street in an undignified arrangement while his hat rolled toward the gutter. 2 city policemen arrived. Then a gendarmerie sergeant. Then, because the young man in the mud was who he was, a process began that had a predictable outcome. He was taken to the precinct, placed in a holding cell with 7 other prisoners, 2 of whom had an arrangement with the duty warden and attempted to rob him within the first hour. What followed was, from a certain angle, unfortunate. From another angle, it was simply physics, the application of professional-grade force to a situation that had demanded it. The 2 would-be robbers survived. One of them had a broken nose. The other had a throat injury that made speaking painful for what he estimated would be about a week. He was sitting against the wall, cataloging his injuries and wondering how long this was going to take, when the cell door opened at 10 the following morning and Staff Captain Andrei Pavlovich Afanasyev walked in. Afanasyev was not what he had expected from an officer of the Secret Service branch of the Imperial Military Staff. He was lean, precise, and possessed of an intelligence that expressed itself not through demonstration but through economy. He asked fewer questions than anyone else would have asked but managed, through the selection of those questions, to arrive at a more complete picture. He had examined the cell, the battered boy in it, and the 2 damaged prisoners with the systematic attention of someone who already knew most of what he was looking at and was only checking for surprises. He presented documentation to the precinct superintendent. He collected Alexei from the cell with the efficiency of a man collecting a package from a post office. He took him to a bathhouse, arranged a meal, and that evening, in a quiet house on the edge of Stavropol, explained what he wanted. The explanation took several hours and covered a great deal of ground. The money Kostrov had been passing, the network it was funding, the French connection that Afanasyev had been tracking for the better part of 8 months. The Count Zernovsky, who sat at the center of the network on the Russian side and who had, so far, managed to insulate himself from direct implication through a combination of social connections, legal resources, and the strategic removal of anyone who might testify against him. Zernovsky knew someone was closing in. He was not panicking. People like Zernovsky rarely panic. They are too confident of their own untouchability for that. But he was making preparations to wind down his activities and disappear to Europe before the consequences arrived. He was also, apparently, continuing to pursue the elimination of the specific individual who had been causing problems since the summer. Afanasyev's plan was to use that pursuit. If the Count believed his target was accessible, if the target appeared apparently vulnerable in territory the Count considered his own, then the Count might be drawn out into an act that was documentable, provable, the kind of direct action that no amount of social connection could entirely excuse away. He wanted Alexei to come with him to the Georgievsk region, to the neighborhood of Zernovsky's estate, to serve as, in the most straightforward possible terms, bait. He also, in what was perhaps the most memorable moment of the entire Stavropol visit, opened a wardrobe in the corner of the study and produced a rifle. Not a percussion muzzle loader. Not the Dre's needle gun, which had represented the cutting edge of available technology so far. Something different. A revolving rifle. Colt. Model 1855. American manufacture. Cylinder mechanism. 6 rounds without reloading. It was, in 1860, genuinely exotic in this part of the world. The man who had confiscated it from a smuggler 4 months earlier had kept it not out of greed but out of simple uncertainty about what to do with it. He was not personally a rifleman. He had been looking for someone who was. He placed the weapon on the table between them. He said, "I believe you have been looking for something like this." The road back from Stavropol to Georgievsk passed through countryside that was becoming more familiar with each trip. He knew these roads now in the way that soldiers know operational terrain. Not just the main routes but the subsidiary paths, the drainage lines, the places where an ambush could be set and the places where it couldn't, the specific distances from this copse of trees to that ridge, the way the light fell in the late afternoon and how shadows moved across the ground. He was learning this country the way you learn a place you intend to stay. Which was, he was slowly admitting to himself exactly what he intended. It had started as improvisation. Survive the first day, then survive the next week, then find the grandfather, then address the most immediate problems. But somewhere between the water channel running for the first time and the bathhouse being christened with a fire that burned correctly and a cold plunge pool that shocked every muscle into grateful awareness, he had stopped thinking of this as a temporary situation. Grigory Prokhorov's life was becoming his life. Not because he had forgotten who he had been. He had not. The memories of Alexei Prokhorov, the Soviet military years, the post-Soviet confusion, the decade of quiet solitude in Vologda, the specific weight of specific mornings beside a specific river, were as clear as they had ever been. They were not fading. They were integrating. They were becoming the background upon which this new foreground was being painted. He was both men simultaneously. He was learning to be that without it feeling like a division. And as they rode south toward whatever Afanasiev had planned, he flew Khan over the hills. The sight that greeted him from 40 meters up, in the late afternoon of the 4th day of travel, was the ambush he had hoped Afanasiev had been overthinking. 12 men. Possibly more, hard to count precisely when they were distributed through the brush with the professional care of people who had done this before. 2 observation posts on the high ground. Horses concealed below the tree line. The kill zone carefully selected for maximum coverage and minimum escape opportunity. He reported back calmly, feeling the connection with Khan break and the world's weight come back into his own body, and told Afanasiev, "We have company." The staff captain did not seem surprised. He assessed the information with the efficiency of someone who had been expecting ambushes in one form or another for most of his professional life, and he made adjustments. What followed was not a clean fight. Clean fights do not exist outside training exercises and the sanitized retellings of people who were not there. The rifle changed things. 6 rounds without reloading, accurate at ranges that dumbfounded the opposition, who had been trained to expect a single shot and then a pause. He used it from the right flank while Yakov and Stepan held the center, and Afanasiev, who turned out to be a genuinely excellent shot with a revolver, covered the approach from the left. He shot well. He always shot well. This was one of the skills that had transferred cleanly across the centuries, because the fundamental physics of projectile weapons had not changed enough to require relearning from scratch. Trofim died. He had not been expecting Trofim to die. Trofim was one of those people you think of as permanent, not because you have consciously assessed their survival prospects, but because their presence has become background assumption, something you take for granted the way you take for granted the availability of air. Large, uncomplicated, reliable Trofim, who had complained about the wooden floors and then laid them with perfect precision, who had laughed at the outhouse plans and then built the best functioning outhouse in the station. Trofim stepped between him and a sawed-off shotgun at a range of approximately 4 meters. The round that had been intended for a 13-year-old boy took Trofim in the chest instead, and Trofim sat down on the road with the careful dignity of a man who has suddenly discovered he needs to rest, and did not get up again. He killed the man who had fired the shotgun. He killed 2 more before the remaining attackers broke and ran. He moved to Afanasiev, who was down, shot through the shoulder, alive but not in any condition to continue immediately. And then he was kneeling in the road with Trofim's body and the taste of gunpowder in the air and the sound of Khan crying somewhere above him, and he felt, for the first time in this borrowed life, something that was not anger, not calculation, not the cold professional assessment of what came next. He felt grief, real grief, the kind that lands in the center of the chest and does not move, the kind that says, this person who was here is no longer here, and the world is diminished. He had felt this before. He had carried the names of many Trofims in his soldier's life. But he had not expected to feel it here now in this. He had not expected to have people to lose. He sat with it for a while. The road was quiet. The hills watched. Khan made wide circles in the late afternoon sky. Then he got up, because there was still work to be done. They found Zernovsky's network. Not through direct confrontation, though that came later in its own time, and we will come to it. They found it through the patient, methodical work that Afanasiev was extraordinarily good at. The ledger in Kostrov's hidden chest, the key that Kostrov had pressed into Alexei's hand before dying, the pattern of payments that ran backward through 3 years of transactions to a set of French accounts that could be traced with sufficient effort to identifiable names. Zernovsky himself made the mistake of coming out into the open when he was convinced that the primary threat had been eliminated. This was the classic error of someone who has been insulated from consequences for long enough to believe that insulation is permanent. He appeared in Pyatigorsk several weeks after the ambush, apparently engaged in normal aristocratic leisure activities, apparently unconcerned about the ongoing investigation. He rode through the town with attendants, comfortable in the assumption that a provincial police inspector's false credential investigation would run out of momentum before it could reach anything that mattered. He passed within 20 meters of Alexei, who was standing outside the station administration building with a new papaka and a set of healing knife wounds. The Count's eyes moved over him with the practiced dismissal of a man of considerable social standing looking at a lower-class boy, registered, assessed, filed as irrelevant and forgotten. He did not recognize him. This was, in retrospect, not surprising. For Zernovsky, the episode at the estate had been a minor irritation. A stray boy who had needed disciplining. The escalating complexity of the subsequent months, the vanished overseer, the problematic camp by Pyatigorsk, the forest encounters, these had been dealt with through intermediaries. He had never seen the face clearly. He had only heard descriptions and children's faces change. He did not recognize him, but Alexei recognized him. In the precise neural network way that a trained intelligence operative remembers a face, not as an emotional experience, not as the hot recognition of an enemy, but as a clean data point. Confirmed, logged, stored. Afanasiev, recovered from his shoulder wound and increasingly senior in the investigation that his Stavropol superiors had taken very seriously once the full scope of what he had been working on became apparent, was building a case. The case required witnesses, documents, and the kind of direct evidence that could withstand the social and legal pressure that Zernovsky would inevitably bring to bear on any prosecution. He was working on all 3. And the young man from Volinsk, who was technically a civilian and a minor and had no formal role in any of this, was finding himself increasingly useful to the investigation in ways that were difficult to explain to anyone who was not aware of certain extraordinary properties. Let us talk about what was being built in Volinsk while all of this was happening. Because the station needed attention, and the attention he brought to it was of an unusual kind. The wooden floors were done. The ceramic tile roof was on. The water ran. The bathhouse existed. The mobile privy was operational. He had a woodworking bench in a small workshop he had added to the property. He had a permanent Cossack horse, the gray with the white blaze he called Zvezda, star, whose temperament was perfect and whose endurance was exactly what the terrain required. He had begun serious weapons training with an old master named Semyon Feofanovich Turov, who lived on a nearby farmstead and who had a reputation as the finest Cossack sword fighter in the region. These sessions began before dawn and ended when Semyon decided they were over, which was always later than Alexei thought reasonable and always exactly at the right time. The Shashka work was systematic, building on the foundations in Grigory's muscle memory, gradually developing the additional dimensions that Alexei's understanding of weapons, acquired across multiple conflicts in multiple theaters, could contribute. Yakov, who had returned from Stavropol shaken by Trofim's death and quietly furious about the network of people who had arranged it, began teaching him Piaston work in earnest. This was something different from conventional cavalry tactics or even special forces doctrine. It was the accumulated field craft of a specific tradition developed over generations of border warfare, shaped by the particular demands of the Caucasian terrain and the particular nature of the opposition. Move without sound. Read the earth. Understand light and shadow. Become irrelevant to the landscape. He was a good student. He was, in fact, a better student than anyone of his apparent age had any right to be, which Yakov noted periodically with an expression that suggested he had developed a theory that he had decided not to articulate. The station itself was recovering. The autumn work, harvest, storage, preparation for winter, proceeded with the grinding efficiency of communities that have been doing this work in this landscape for generations and know exactly what needs to happen by what date to ensure that nobody freezes or starves before spring. He contributed where he could, which increasingly meant contributing financially as well as physically, because the trophii, the spoils from the several encounters he had had with fighters and bandits in the preceding months, had accumulated into a sum that was meaningful by local standards. He hired help. He paid fairly. He listened to the advice of people who knew things he didn't, which included almost everyone when the subject was agriculture, local law, or traditional Cossack social custom. He learned. He made mistakes. He occasionally made decisions that struck everyone as bizarre and then turned out to be correct, which was accumulating a reputation. The grandfather was recovering. This was, in its quiet way, the most important thing. Ignat Arafyevich Prokhorov was an ancient tree, deep-rooted, shaped by decades of hard weather, genuinely extraordinary. Not in the supernatural sense but in the more important human one. He was formidably competent, formidably principled, and possessed of the specific dignity that belongs to someone who has spent their entire life doing the right thing in difficult circumstances and has therefore arrived at a completely justified confidence in their own judgment. He watched his grandson with those deep-set eyes and said very little most of the time. But he watched. One evening, a week before the departure for Stavropol, he had sat the boy down and told him about Alexei Prokhorov the Isol, the Battle of Poltava, the marked warriors of the family line. And then he had given him the whistle. And now, flying over the hills on one wing and walking the roads on 2 feet, feeling the double consciousness of 2 lives and one destiny settling into something he could actually live, he was beginning to understand what the old man in the crumbling hut had meant. Not the bright thread, not the falcon, not the complicated geopolitical reality of a colonial frontier in the 1860s. He understood all of that on a surface level. He was beginning to understand the deeper layer. The deeper layer was this: he had been put here to stay. Not to fix a single problem. Not to neutralize a single conspiracy. Not to kill a single count, though that might eventually be necessary. He had been put here to root himself in this time, this place, this family, this community, and to bring with him the things that had been forged in him by 2 centuries of future knowledge, and to deploy those things in the service of something that his 20th century self could only partially understand. He was the last of the line. He was also, in a very specific sense, the first of a new version of it. The hunt for Zernovsky's network was resolved in stages, like a mathematical proof working toward its conclusion. Afanasiev returned to Georgievsk with official credentials and a mandate from the Stavropol headquarters that superseded local authority in questions involving espionage and treason. He brought with him a small team of men from the secret section of the military staff, which operated under different rules than the regular police or the local gendarmerie. Zernovsky, faced with officials who had both the authority to arrest him and the documentary evidence to support a charge, made the move that every person in his position eventually makes. He tried to run. He had a route planned. He had money moved. He had contacts in Europe who were prepared to receive him. He had calculated, with the confidence of someone who had been calculating his way through problems for decades, that the window for escape was there. He had not accounted for Khan. The Falcon's surveillance range extended approximately 5 kilometers from his position. From a sufficient altitude, tracking a single carriage moving along the Georgievsk road in the pre-dawn darkness was exactly the kind of problem his visual system was designed to solve. Alexei, lying in a ditch near the eastern edge of the estate grounds, watched the carriage leave through 4 kilometers of progress before its route intersected with the prepositioned cavalry unit that Afanasiev had placed there 18 hours earlier. The Count was arrested at dawn on a road between his estate and his escape. In his carriage they found correspondence. 3 years of it. Instructions, confirmations, financial records, the names of every person in his network on both sides of the connection. The case that Afanasiev had been building for 8 months was complete. What happened after that was the complex machinery of imperial justice, which operates on timescales and with considerations that are orthogonal to the simpler mechanics of field operations. It would take years for the full prosecution to unfold. The diplomatic implications, French intelligence assets being named in a Russian espionage case, would complicate things further. Zernovsky's social connections would delay and attenuate the consequences. But the network was broken. The funding was cut. The armed bands in the hills that had been supplemented by French gold would increasingly find themselves operating without external support, which changed the nature of the problem significantly. And a specific count in a specific cell in Stavropol had been informed that a 13-year-old Cossack boy had been a primary element in his downfall. We do not know how he received this information. History does not always record reactions. But we can imagine. In the autumn of 1860, on a morning that smelled of first frost and wood smoke and the specific cold sweetness of apples waiting for the harvest, the household in Volinsk was complete in a way it had not been before. Ignat Erefyevich sat on the veranda in the rocking chair, pipe lit, watching the light on the hills. He was thinner than he had been before the raid, slower in his movements, but his eyes had lost none of their quality. Yelena was in the kitchen, the new kitchen, with the cast-iron stove and the built-in counter for prep work and the shelves that were already accumulating the preserved food stores that would see them through winter. Her daughter ran across the yard with some urgent errand that 3-year-olds always have. Her feet bare despite the temperature, immune to cold in the way of small children everywhere. Aslan, the young man from the hills, whose father's brothers had tried to have him killed for being too willing to trade with Russians, who had been found bleeding to death in a river valley by a boy he had no reason to expect sympathy from, was walking daily in the yard now, building strength back into shoulders and arms that the double shoulder wounds had severely compromised. He was quiet, as he had always been, but the quality of the quiet had changed. It was less the quiet of someone conserving energy for survival and more the quiet of someone who has found a perch they can stay on. Myron the carpenter was somewhere on the property doing something with wood, as he always was. His son had been working with him for the past 3 weeks, which suggested the relationship between the carpenter and this particular client was becoming something more like a long-term arrangement. Khan sat on the peak of the roof, watching everything with the absolute impartiality of a creature whose visual field is so much wider than anything human that all human business appears roughly equivalent in its smallness. The grandfather caught him looking at the falcon. He said, "The old stories say the saker sees clearly because it sees without wanting. It does not want the mouse to be a rabbit. It sees what is there." Alexei thought about this. He said, "I have been trying to figure out what I'm here for. Not for the investigation. Not for the network. Something larger." The grandfather drew on his pipe and let a long column of smoke go into the cold air. He said, "You are here to protect the thread. You are here because the thread became too thin. Look around you. Is the thread thinner or stronger than it was 3 months ago?" He looked around. The house stood. The water ran. The roof kept the rain out. Yelena and Mashenka had a safe place and a family name. Aslan was alive and walking. The network that had been funding violence in the hills was broken. 2 old families, the Prokhorov line and whatever Aslan represented, had been, in their small particular way, stitched together rather than torn further apart. He thought about Trofim, who was not here. He thought about Matvey, the father he had never met in person but whose grave he had stopped at on the road south. The thread was not thin. He said, "Stronger." The grandfather said, "Then you are doing the work." He paused. "Even if you are not sure what the work is, there is something that needs to be understood about what kind of story this is. It would be easy to frame it as a wish fulfillment. A man who lived a hard life gets a second chance in a different body, and with his 21st century knowledge, proceeds to improve everything and vanquish all enemies. There is an element of that. He did build better things than anyone expected. He did handle threats more efficiently than a 13-year-old should have been able to handle them. He did, repeatedly, benefit from the combination of future knowledge and supernatural capability in ways that gave him significant advantages. But that framing misses the texture of what actually happened. It misses the grief. Trophim's death. The father he inherited in memory and never had in life. The mother and sisters, Grigory's mother and sisters, killed in the raid that scarred the station before he arrived. These were real losses, felt with the full weight of a dual consciousness, mourned in the cramped vocabulary of a boy's heart and the expanded language of a soldier's experience. It misses the relationships. The grandfather, who knew more than he said and trusted more than most men would have trusted, who gave the whistle and the sword and then stepped back and let his grandson become whatever he was going to become. Yelena, who never asked questions about where the food came from or why the repairs were better than anyone local could have done, who simply worked steadily and well, in the way of people who have learned not to take stability for granted. Mashenka, who called him brother and meant it with the total commitment that children bring to their naming. Yakov, who was the best teacher he had had since the old sergeant in the training battalion who had first explained to him that fear and courage were not opposites but relatives. It misses the learning. He had not arrived fully formed. He had arrived with significant assets and significant gaps, and the gaps had to be filled by genuine effort. The saber work with Semyon Feofanovich required weeks of frustrating repetition before the old forms began to flow correctly through the boy's smaller, differently proportioned body. The Piaston training required sustained physical development. He began running before dawn every morning, building the baseline endurance that the work required, discovering that the body's capacity to improve was genuinely extraordinary when properly driven. The local social dynamics, the intricate web of station politics and family obligations and honor codes and debt structures, had to be navigated through careful attention and multiple embarrassing mistakes. And it misses the mystery that still remained, the bright thread that the dying old man had mentioned. He understood it now as something like cultural continuity, the thread that connected a family, a community, a tradition across time, that could be weakened by loss and violence and disruption until it approached the point of breaking. He understood that his role was to strengthen it rather than simply survive within it. But there was more. He could feel it. The falcon whistle, the chest, the healing, the specific way that the ancestral saber fit his hand as though it had been waiting. These were not random. These were not cosmic coincidence. These were elements of a system, and systems have purposes, and the purpose of this one was still only partially visible. The account in the scrolled papers, the name on the saber stamp, the stories the grandfather told about Alexei the Isal. There was something there that he had not yet fully assembled. A lineage that extended back further than the Battle of Poltava. A connection that the Kipchak Khan legend hinted at but did not fully describe. He had time to find out. He was 13 years old, with the healing capacity of whatever the 3 dots represented and the accumulated skills of a man who had already survived everything the 20th century could throw at him. He had a family that was his. He had a community that was beginning to trust him. He had a falcon. He had time. There is a moment toward the end of autumn 1860 that is the proper resting place for this first part of the story. Evening. The household at supper. The first genuine winter cold pushing through the walls, but the new stove holding it at bay with the cheerful efficiency of a machine that has been properly designed. Soup from a recipe of Yelena's that had been developed across several weeks of iteration and was now clearly superior to anything he could have produced. The grandfather eating slowly, with the careful attention of an old man who has learned not to waste anything. Mashenka narrating something at length, a story about the neighbor's dog and an Incident involving a fallen fence post. The narrative structure loose but the emotional investment absolute. Aslan in the corner, which he preferred, saying little but eating well and listening to everything. Khan on the window ledge outside, visible through the glass, which was one of Volinsk's more unusual household features. Windows with actual glass panes, not just wooden shutters. He would not come inside. He never did. But he was there. After the meal, the table cleared, the children. Mashenka fell asleep at the table and had to be carried. Put to bed, the grandfather retired with his pipe and his dignity intact. Aslan went to the stable, which was where he preferred to sleep, not because it was comfortable but because it was liminal, a space between inside and out that suited his current state. Yelena was washing dishes at the counter by the light of the oil lamp. He was sitting at the table with a piece of paper and a piece of charcoal sketching something, a modification to the water channel intake that he had been thinking about, a way to add a simple settling basin to keep the supply cleaner during the spring melt. She said, without turning, "Do you think about where you come from?" He said, "Every day." She said, "I used to think about Voronezh all the time. The house there, the people, the way things smelled. Now I think about this house more. Is that wrong?" He said, "No. It is exactly right." She finished the dishes and dried her hands. She said, "Thank you for not sending us away." He said, "There was never any question of that." She nodded, and the lamp made her shadow long on the wall, and she went to her room, and the house settled into the particular quiet of a place where people are sleeping. He sat for a while with the sketch and the lamp and the sound of the falcon shifting on the window ledge outside. He was thinking about the thread, about how it had not broken, about what it would take to strengthen it further, over the years to come, years that stretched ahead of him with a clarity that felt different from anything he had experienced in his first life. In that life, the years had contracted as he aged, each one shorter and emptier than the last. In this one, they opened out in every direction, full of things that needed doing and problems that needed solving and people who were counting on the work getting done. He was 52 years old in a soul. He was 13 years old in a body. He was in 1860 in a year. He was Prokhorov in a name and a lineage and a set of obligations that extended backward into history and forward into a future he could not see. He was, for the first time in either of his lives, exactly where he was supposed to be. The saber on its hook by the door caught the lamplight. The simple scabbard, the worn grip, the falcon stamp near the guard. The sword of Alexei Prokhorov, Esau, born 1674, died Poltava 1709, which had traveled through 150 years of Cossack memory to reach this room. He picked it up. The balance was, as it had always been, perfect. The blade extended from the hand like an answer rather than a question. Outside, Khan called once. A single sharp note, like an announcement, and was quiet. The lamp burned. The stove held. The thread held. What makes a man out of time? Is it the century he was born in, or the century he is needed in? The soldier who became a boy, the boy who carried the weight of a soldier, the soldier who learned that the most important battles are not fought with rifles or sabers but with consistency, with showing up, with building things, with keeping the people around you alive and fed and sheltered and capable of doing the same for others. He had fought in 2 wars and understood neither of them in the end, as well as he understood the specific value of a water channel that worked, a roof that did not burn, a woman and her daughter who had been walking toward nothing and were now walking toward a home. The great machinery of history, the French foreign policy, the Caucasian War's long resolution, the modernization of the Russian Empire, the coming decades of change that would eventually transform everything about this world, that machinery would turn on regardless of what he did. He was not under any illusion about his ability to redirect the large current of events. But the small things, the thread, those he could maintain, those he could strengthen, those he could keep from breaking for one more generation and then the next and then the generation after that. The 3 dots on his wrist pulsed with his heartbeat. They had been doing this since the beginning, and he had long since stopped finding it strange. A dead man's sword in his hand. A dying man's falcon on the ledge. A borrowed body, growing stronger daily. A family that was not his by blood, or was it? The Prokhorov blood ran in both of them, Grigory and Alexei both, across the bridge of 2 lifetimes. He was the last. He was also the beginning. In the years that followed, and they did follow one after another, each one denser and more layered than the one before, the station of Volensk would change. Some changes would be visible. A better-built community, with ceramic-roofed houses that did not burn as easily, a water system that other stations would eventually copy, a bathhouse schedule that became a community ritual of unusual social value. Some changes would be less visible. A web of relationships, obligations, and mutual understanding that slowly became the strongest defense the community had, stronger than any fortification. And at the center of all of it, a young man, for he was young in body, whatever he was in mind, who spent his mornings training with a sword and his evenings planning the next useful thing, who flew a Saker falcon over the hills in the late afternoon and watched the world with eyes not entirely his own, who kept a chest that the world could not see and kept careful inventory of what was owed and what was owing. He carried two names as he carried two sabers. Both were his. Neither was complete without the other. The bright thread held. And so we return to where we began. A barn. Rope. The smell of old straw and dried blood. But now we understand it differently. That moment was not an ending. It was not even, properly speaking, a beginning. It was a transfer. A relay baton passed across an impossible distance, from one life to another, from one century to another, by the determined hands of a dying old man who had been keeping faith with something ancient and important his entire long life, and who had found, at the last possible moment, the right person to pass it to. Not because Alexei Prokhorov was exceptional in the way that heroes of stories are supposed to be exceptional, gifted from birth, destined, chosen. He was exceptional in the much more important way. He was stubborn, and he had learned from his failures, and he was deeply uncomfortable with people being harmed unnecessarily, and when he found something worth protecting, he protected it without reservation or fanfare. These are, it turns out, the qualities that matter most. The supernatural capabilities, the chest, the healing, the falcon, the three dots, these were tools. Extraordinary tools, strange tools, tools that bent the rules of the natural world in ways that science cannot account for. But tools nonetheless, and tools have no value without the judgment to use them well. The judgment was his. It always had been. In both lives. Across both centuries. Somewhere over the northern Caucasus, in the autumn of 1860, a Saker falcon turns lazy circles in the clear, cold air. Below him, a Cossack station. Clay-walled houses with ceramic roofs that catch the light differently than the thatch of their neighbors. A thin silver thread of water running from a hillside channel to a small pool in a yard where a dog sleeps in a patch of sun, and a small girl runs with arms wide open. An old man on a veranda with a pipe. A young woman hanging washing on a line. A lean, dark young man doing careful exercises in the shadow of the stable wall. And a boy who is not entirely a boy, standing in the yard, looking up at the falcon, one hand resting on the hilt of a sword at his hip. The falcon calls once. The boy raises his hand. The thread holds. And the work continues. There are people in this world, people in every generation, in every country, in every culture, who are put somewhere they did not expect to be and asked to hold something together that would otherwise fall apart. Not because they are the most talented or the most gifted or the most specially equipped. Simply because they are there and they are willing and they can see what needs to be done. This is the oldest story there is. It is also always happening right now. Think about the people in your own life who hold threads, who show up, who build things, who refuse to let the important things break even when everything around them is failing. Think about what it costs them and what it means, and whether you have ever told them that you see what they are doing. The world is full of marked warriors. They rarely announce themselves. They are usually just the ones who stay. The story of Grigory Prokhorov, the boy, the soldier, the threadkeeper, continues beyond the autumn of 1860. There are battles still to come, mysteries still to be unraveled, a lineage still to be understood. But this is where the foundation is laid. This is where the work begins. And beginnings are, in their own way, the most important thing. What do you carry that was given to you by someone who needed you to carry it? What have you built that might outlast you? Leave your thoughts below. The thread, after all, is woven by many hands.